Welcome back to Watercolours with Caroline, the second lesson in this series of our fall lessons. And this week we are painting some quail eggs from our own quail at home here. They are domestic quail. They lay an egg every day. It's like a chicken, but they're kind of small and very pretty. My friend gave me a nest, which I think is a robin's nest. So we're taking a little bit of artistic license and we're putting those pretty quail eggs in the robin's nest for our painting. So you need a piece of probably 5x7 paper and another little bit for the eggs, which is about 2.5 inches by 7 inches, or whatever you like. And I'm using 140-pound Arches paper, as I usually do. My paints are Winsor & Newton. They're also Core. There's a few M. Graham and a few Daniel Smith. I have my favorite colors in each one. So get your paints ready, your paper ready, your brushes, and let's paint together. And what we're going to start with today, we're going to start with the nest. And then while the nest is drying, we're going to move on to the individual eggs. Now, I did two different ones. I did this one first with the 3 eggs on the one strip. And then on Wednesday, I did 3 little individual squares because I wasn't sure which layout I was going to prefer for mounting, but I think I might prefer this one, having done both. And I think it was a little bit easier to paint. I found that with this one, I found it a little bit harder to paint the sort of the shadows in the background. But with this one, I really felt I needed some division. It looked weird without it. And I put these funny little grasses here, and I think they work okay.
Yeah, I love that. And I love your shadows there. They're beautiful.
And that's two layers. So when you do your first shadow, let the first one dry, and then you can do a slightly darker one for a second layer, because it doesn't always come out dark enough with the first one. So let's get my so this is, it's a bit of a artistic license here, because this, I believe, was a robin's nest that my friend gave me. And these eggs are quail eggs. We raise quail and they lay all different colored eggs. They're so beautiful. They're beautiful blues and browns. And I just thought, what a beautiful thing to paint. And they look so cute in this nest my friend gave me. So that's where that all came from. And this is our sort of color range we're using. I'm mostly going to use Cerulean Blue to mix the blues for the eggs. I tried Cobalt Teal, but it was just a little bit too tealy. Raw Sienna, we're going to use a lot, burnt sienna, sepia, and ultramarine blue. And then here's some of the mixes to make the eggs slightly less blue, because they are a dull down blue. I mixed raw sienna with the cerulean just a little bit to get this kind of a slightly different looking. And then with burnt sienna, good for the shadows, a little bit too dark for the egg. And the cobalt teal with raw sienna was pretty too. Really pretty, but I preferred this one. It has that look. The eggs look kind of granulated. I'm just gonna go actually get the real eggs, because they are so pretty. I'll be right with me when I went to class. So you can see they're fairly small, and this one under the camera doesn't look quite as blue as it is. The camera sort of putting a bit of shade on it, but they are that kind of like blue, but with raw sienna undertones, and they come with all sorts of different splotches. This one just has a few little brown splotches. Some of the blue ones have more, and then some like have really, really dark. I just think they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. We need before we start this one, because we're starting on dry paper, we need to have a good amount of raw sienna mixed up and some cerulean blue for the background, and we need them mixed up ahead of time, because we're working on dry paper, so we won't have time to make more to get the wet and wet effect that we would like. So this is quite often I don't bother ahead of time, because I like that 1 to 2 minutes for the water to soak in while I'm mixing the paint. But this time I want to get it all mixed up and ready. I'll get some, and cerulean blue for the start is going to be a background color, very, very loose background color. So I want to have it quite watery, not too strong. And this first layer, this sort of wettish layer, it's going to be put down quite fast so that it's we get a little bit of wet in wet effect with the blue and the raw sienna. So a nice watery cerulean blue. And just check a little bit more of my raw sienna, not too dark. One of the things that a lot of people did on Wednesday was they went too dark with their first raw sienna layer. You can always darken it up as we go along. And I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna ready too, because it's nice for a shadow color, a wet in wet sort of shadow color. And a little bit of burnt sienna. We're going to use the burnt sienna lots anyway, so it's something that can sort of sit there and be useful as we go along. Pretty limited palette on this one. Right, I've got nice big splashes here. And I'm going to use a number 8 brush and possibly even switch to a number 10 brush, because what I want to do is I want to put the nest color on in raw sienna. And then the background in cerulean blue is very light and very rough. If you can see, the edges here are just ragged, and the two can blend together in the first layer. The cerulean blue can blend with the raw sienna in the first layer, so that there's no definite line. You hardly even notice the cerulean blue, but it does complement the colors we're using and picks up the color of the eggs to make them stand out more. So that's why we're using that. We're going to start with the raw sienna. And I've got my number 8 brush. Now I want to start, actually I'm going to switch, sorry, I'm going to switch to my number 6, because just to start, my eggs are dry. So this is the most careful part of the painting. First of all, I want to paint around those eggs very, very carefully before I start with the looser brush strokes. Just around here. And I switched to a smaller brush because I want to get into these little areas around the eggs carefully, so I have a nice crisp edge. And this is where the masking fluid didn't do it. It didn't give these eggs that lovely crisp edge that I was hoping for. Now, as I come out and around the edge of the nest, I'm lifting my brush and making my strokes a little bit more open so that I can get into this little piece here. And the reason that I want to do this as I get close to the edges, I don't want it to dry with, you can see over here, it could start to dry with a hard edge there. So I just want to kind of mess up that edge a little bit so that I don't get a hard, dry edge if things start to dry. And then I can come back very carefully to go around my eggs with the point of my brush. It is a bit of a pain having to leave these eggs dry rather than mask them, but the end product is worth it. And I also think it's a good discipline. It's really good to not rely on masking fluid or something, and actually train yourself, train your hand, your brush, your thinking to get used to leaving that white. And you can see my paint is fairly wet. It's still wet here. I can even drop in a little bit more shadow in the depth of that nest so that it really makes the eggs stand out more. We're going to put way more shadow in there later. Not to worry. Now I've got that all done. So I will switch back to my number 8 brush so I can be a little bit more loose. And my paint is wet. I don't know if you can see, but it's really standing up away from my paper. Make it a little bit brighter.
Is that raw sienna, Caroline? This
is just raw sienna, yes. And sometimes
it looks darker on camera.
Yeah, I've brightened my camera up a little bit. Sometimes just I've got a light on it as well. Sometimes just the camera and the light doesn't represent it as truly as it is in real life. But it's just raw sienna.
Okay.
And quite a bit of water. Mine is not very dark. I've put a little bit extra in in the depth of the nest here to darken it up there. It's just extra paint. But now I put a bit more water with my paint, and my brush strokes going around the nest are going to be in that oval shape that the nest makes, skipping here and there where I want the really highlighted strands of kind of dry grass and straw. Now the dry grass and straw kind of crosses over some places. So when you've got the kind of the oval shape going, you can use the point of your brush a little bit to do a few like little crossovers in there. And you don't have to worry too much at this stage because you can do a lot of that with the next 2 layers as well. So as I'm doing these strokes coming around, I am allowing some of them to cross over a bit so that I can make that pattern, which I'll be able to find with my darks when I come in with my darks. I'll be able to find that crisscross kind of pattern to put the darks in. Even though we're working loose and quite wet, like the paint should be fairly wet, you don't have to rush. I've really noticed, I've watched some excellent painters online who do really loose work, but they do it so slowly and so carefully with such measured brush strokes that it looks hurried and loose and amazing, but they stop and think about every brush stroke, every color they put down. It's quite amazing to watch, and they take forever. I sometimes get a bit bored just watching their slow progress. But so you don't have to rush. Now I mixed a little bit of that burnt sienna up, which I'm going to get now. And I'm just going to, while this is wet, I'm going to add a little bit of that burnt sienna for some depth of color. And I'm not going to worry about all the extras right now. This is the point where this edge is still a little bit wet. I want to switch to the Cerulean Blue with a bigger brush still. I'm actually going to go to my number 10 just to kind of show how loose this part needs to be and get my Cerulean Blue. Now, what people tended to do at the live class, I noticed, was they continued this oval stroke with the Cerulean Blue. Try to avoid that by pulling your stroke out horizontally so that you have that kind of ragged edge. And yes, you need to kind of go next to the raw sienna with a bit of a curved stroke, but also you want to try and get this outside edge more horizontal and just very loose, so it doesn't come to the edge of your tape. You can do it in different ways. You can like smush your brush down and push, which is a great way to get a nice loose stroke. You can lift your brush up and kind of do this. If your paint's wet enough, you can work fairly slowly. And where it touches your nest, it can bleed into the colors. That's fine. So I get that edge by sometimes like pushing my brush down and just letting it do its thing and then just lifting. And what I do want to do is on this corner here, I kind of want to pull it out a little bit because I want that balance. I don't want it to feel like the nest is sort of tipping. Just having my brush stroke come out a little bit like that is going to give more of a base for the shadow. And the thing is, when you're finished with all of the nest and the eggs and the strands, you don't even notice this blue in the background. You don't notice it's there, but it's important for the complementary colors and to pick the eggs out when we're done. So there, I'm going to, at this point, I'm just going to pause the video while you catch up, because we're going to let that settle in and dry, and then we're going to work on the 3 little eggs. So let's just pause for a minute, get my eggs centered under there. And I have some Cerulean Blue mixed up, and it needs to be fairly watery, the Cerulean Blue, not too strong. And the egg is going to have a little highlight on it. So I want to just, with a little bit of water, I've switched now to a number 4 brush, with a little bit of water, Let's zoom in a bit more. You can see even more. That's better. I'm going to put water where that highlight is so that I can keep that really light. And just like we did with the petals last week, we started at the darkest part of the petal. So the darkest part of the egg is going to be the base down here where it's close to the table. So I want to start with that because it's going to be the darkest part, and dip my brush in a little water and come up to that water that I put on the egg. And I'm going to keep dipping my brush in my towel now so it's not too wet, and come up to that little area of highlight. And the only place I really want shadow is along the edges of the eggs. I'm going to put a little bit more paint around the edges. And just like we did with the flower petal, I'm going to wash my brush, get it nice and dry on my towel, and just agitate that in with my brush like this. This is my phone going off now, and I can't mute myself. I guess I could mute the phone, but that doesn't help my husband if he gets the call he needs. So there, so that's our first egg. We can at this point put a little bit of shadow on with some cerulean blue, not cerulean, I'm sorry, cobalt blue, and a little bit of cobalt. Not too watery because our egg's already watery. And if it's not completely dry, can add a little bit of cobalt in the shaded area. Just here. Just a tiny bit. We can put a couple more layers of shade on later when this is dry. We don't have to put them all on at once. In fact, it's way better if you don't put them all on at once. And that's our first little egg done. Now, the second one is going to be one of the much darker eggs that have the darker splotches. And I put that in the center because if I put it to either end, it would lead the eye too much out of the picture. If I put it here and the two lighter ones on the sides, you're drawn more into the center of the picture and then up towards the nest. So you have to think when you place things, where's going to be the best place in the composition to have that strong design or strong color. But we want a base color on here. And of course, the base color is going to be our raw sienna. And you can mix a little bit of burnt sienna in with it just to give it a little bit more color, just a tiny bit. Let's get my palette over here. Let's give it a bit of a, I'll clean it so that you can see what I did. So I'm going to get my raw sienna, like we had for the nest. Just cleaned mine up a bit. And I'm going to get a tiny bit of burnt sienna and just put it in that raw sienna to warm up the color a little bit. And water. And again, I want to highlight on the egg. So I'm going to wet the top sort of center part of the egg and start at the bottom where we want the strongest color. And I've switched to, I'm still a number 4 brush. It gives me more control. And makes it easier to paint the edge of the egg really nicely. Again, leaving that wet space, not painting the wet space, and allowing that paint to just, it'll just seep into that wet area all by itself. And just, it will just leave that highlight. If you come too close to the wet area and it gets all covered in paint, you can use what's called a thirsty brush, clean, almost dry brush, and you can just push your paint back a little bit if it's invading too much. Mine seems to be okay, so I don't want to do too much pushing around. With the camera up close and the close-up, you can see I have gone over my pencil line a little bit. But that's a great way to get rid of your pencil lines. Somebody asked me on Wednesday, how can I get rid of my pencil lines? Well, you can't erase them. As soon as you have paint on them, they are there forever. You can't erase through the paint. But if you just cover them with your paint, eventually they disappear. When you get the second layer and a little bit of background color, the pencil lines disappear completely. And mine are a little bit stronger than I usually have them, just so you can see them on camera. I wouldn't normally have them that strong. So we got the 2 eggs down. Now the third egg is still the Cerulean Blue, but I have mixed a little bit of raw sienna with this to make it a more greenish blue. Now let's go to my cerulean. And the amount of raw sienna you need is so tiny. You just get a little tiny bit on the tip of your brush and mix that in, and that is your color. You're not mixing a great big thick puddle of paint. And the nice thing is they will separate a little bit as you paint, so you'll get that kind of texture almost to the shell of the egg. Same thing with the water. You want to have a highlight on the egg, so towards the top center of the egg, wet that area. And again, start at the bottom. And it doesn't matter if some of your egg is more blue and some is more raw sienna-ish, because that's exactly how the eggs are in real life. They are not one color. They are a whole variety of colors on one egg. So it's even nice. I'm going to show you in 1 second. I'm going to get a little bit more blue for the top of the egg. So it's more blue than the raw sienna mix. And come right up to my pencil line, so eventually it will disappear. I'm going to get a little bit more raw sienna now on my brush, and just down here at the base, I'm going to just let that little bit of extra raw sienna I had on my brush just blend into that still wet paint. So I get that wet and wet look of a slightly different color, a little bit of shadow, and the paints will be mixing wet and wet on the paper, which means they'll give a lovely texture because they will slightly separate, slightly granulate, and look very realistic, because the eggs have quite a bit of texture to them and quite a bit of granulation in their color and quite a bit of variation where you see it more raw sienna and where you see it more blue. Plus, this is just our first layer. You're not going to worry at this layer because you can put more layers. You can put the dots, the colors, the brownie colors on. Now, when I did mine, I think on this one, I'm going to switch to an even smaller brush. I'm going to switch to my number 2. And while this one's still a little bit wet, I'm going to get my favorite brown mix, which is Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna. Get some burnt sienna. Sorry, not got it in the right place for you. So Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna is one of my favorite brown mixes because you can vary it so much. And I got a little bit more Burnt Sienna in this layer. And while this is still wet, I can add a little bit of the texture and the dots, like all of these areas to the egg. And I don't have to do them all at this stage. I can put some in and I can do more at another stage. So these ones will appear to be less defined than the ones I put on at a later stage. They'll be more, because they're going on slightly damp paint, they'll be more fuzzy. And I can put some of the little use just the tip of my brush. There's a lot of little tiny dots on these. And it's probably easier to work up those in layers as well, so that you're not overdoing all the dots. Another lovely way to get a super lovely edge to your egg is to have one of these splotches going off the edge. So you can sharpen up the edge with your brush and then pull the dots in. And I'm going to put more in here later, but I don't want to go into that really wet spot in the middle at this point. These are just the first ones that I'm putting on. And this one too. This one's just starting to dry. I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to this. And this one is just at a good stage to have some of those put on that are going to blend into that slightly damp paint and make a lighter dot. So you've got two varieties of color when you come to do the speckling. I guess it's speckled, isn't it? Not dots. And this is a good, if you have any of the photos I sent you, it's a good time to just have it in front of you so that you can actually see the kind of shapes that these speckles form on the egg. And you're not sort of trying to guess, like, what would it look like? Just a few on there, not a lot. We're going to put more on later. And those will become quite fuzzy and more indistinct than the ones that we put on later. And if you can see on this egg, it's not like a really dark. There's a difference between this really dark, sharp shape and this one that's more calcified and sort of got like a white patina on it. Different sort of look to it. And of course, as you come around the egg, it gets darker on the other side. So we're trying to go for all of that variety. And then we're going to leave these to dry naturally while we go back and work on the nest. So I'm going to go and see how wet my nest is. Still quite damp. So I'll zoom out, pause the recording and get my hairdryer going to get this nice and dry. And you might want to do the same thing when you've finished speckling your eggs. Just make sure that your nest is really dry for the next stage. So let's pause. Almost forgot that bit. So what I've mixed up now, I have to repeat, sorry. I have mixed up burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to make a mid-tone brown for the colors in the middle of the nest. And I want to, again, very carefully with this, paint around the eggs before I get into the rest. And again, as I come to the edge of the nest here, I don't want to have a strong brush stroke. I want to have these broken up brush strokes that look like the dried grass and mud and moss and all the things that are in the nest. So I can lift my brush up just using the point and start to make those shapes. But in here, around by the eggs, where they're in the very dark, muddiest area of the egg, I need to paint around them very carefully. If you really like masking fluid and you do well with it, then you can mask out the eggs if you have stuff that's not dated or gone very goopy like mine has. You will probably find it much easier if you've masked out the eggs. I just never seem to be able to do it, so it works for me. And see how I'm also, as I'm getting to those brush strokes around the edge, I'm crisscrossing some of them, so they're not all just going around like this, around and around like this. They are having some disarray to them where they're weaving in and out. And it doesn't matter if you do it perfectly, because the eye will weave them in and out for you. Nobody will be able to discern like where they cross, but they will notice that it looks like a nest, and that's all that matters. Oh, I've got to make sure I don't get my wrist in the wet paint. So take your time going around the eggs very, very carefully. Keep your paint nice and wet, because if you keep your paint nice and wet, it gives you a long time to keep working. You can work the paint for a long time. You don't get backgrounds. You don't get dry edges against wet edges. If your paint's the right consistency, you should see it is shiny. You should see it standing up away from your paper. For a long time, you should be looking at it and seeing it's still shiny. It's still standing up away from the paper. And at any time you want to, you can change your mixture. I'm stopping right now and adding a little bit more burnt sienna to the mixture. So I'm changing the color to a lighter brown as I come around this area where it's not so dark. And again, my brush strokes need to be sometimes solid like this, and sometimes light and crisscrossy. So I have a nice variety, especially as we get down to this part of the nest. There's a lot less lights, and I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue to my mix, make it a little bit darker. So down here, where it's very muddy, the nest, and less light, I'm going to add in a little bit of ultramarine to that mixture. And I'm going to zoom in even more so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And this is where I'm going to just pull up. This is a number 6. I'm going to pull up to the tip of my brush and make this area ragged along the edge, but not ragged here. What makes it very interesting for the viewer is if you have a combination of the two. What is very boring for the viewer is if all your lines are thin and wispy and raggedy. On the actual nest and on the paint photograph of the nest, you can see that some of these areas were quite just thick, dark, muddy areas. And then other areas, you could see the thin, wispy, dry grass. And remember, we've got one more layer to put on that we can put even more dark and more detail. But we're getting definitely less loose at this stage. And this part of the nest around here in the photograph was quite, let's grab my photograph, quite dark. And also around here, quite dark, and we're going to go much darker on the inside of the nest. You see what I mean? Like there's big areas here and here and in here, and especially in here, just big areas of dark space. I'm making mine a little bit more dark here than the photograph, but that's fine. You don't have to stick exactly to a photograph. As long as you have a light and a dark side to something. Just getting a little bit more burnt sienna. I'm making the mix not quite so dark now. And you can see my paint is so wet that I can work on any area of this without, worrying about putting too wet paint against wet paint. Now this edge here, less detail. I'm going to take out a bit of the detail, but I'm going to put the detail around this part. I'm going to get my smaller brush and put it around there. So on this side. What this really calls for is a combination of loose and careful, which is a very hard thing to achieve actually. It's one of the hardest things to achieve with watercolor, is being really loose with your brush strokes and at the same time being very measured and careful with your brush strokes. And you kind of have to know where you're going before you start. You have to really observe your nest or your photo of your nest. Look at where the lights and the darks are. look at the shape of the shadows and really try and commit those to memory almost. You have to keep looking also, but if you have that idea in your mind, your kind of map of where you're going, it's helpful to be more loose if you kind of know what you're aiming for. And sometimes it takes a few times practice. You can't just do one painting and expect it'll all be good the first one. And this is my third nest painting, so I'm kind of getting used to the shape of the nest. Now I've got my very thin liner brush. It's a number 2 liner brush, and I'm going to use that with that dark mix. And even I might even try some of my raw sienna mix too. There's no reason not to go back to, I'm actually going back to a little bit of the raw sienna for some of those wispy bits of dry grass. Actually picked up more of the raw sienna. That's going to be some of the lighter ones. And with that very thin liner brush, that's where I'm going to put all the bits on the edge that are sticking out. And this is why I didn't worry that the cerulean blue was going to bleed into the raw sienna nest, because it doesn't matter at this point. You can't even see where the two meet. It's all behind this. And if you can see it, just like here, what a lovely effect you have of those two just kind of bleeding into each other, where you have this dry grass going over the top. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to check my photograph so that I don't get too far away from how it really is. I can get, if I start doing this with my little thin brush, I can start getting a little bit carried away, and then I might start inventing things that don't look nest-like. Now, I do notice in my photograph over here, there is quite a lot of stuff going on. I don't want quite that much stuff going on, but I am going to make it a little bit more chaotic over here with a bit more happening. And I'm just in my raw sienna at the moment. I'm going to go back to my darker mix. So I just picked up some of my darker mix, which is the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and add a little bit of this. And again, we are going to go in with one more darker layer. And before we do that, we will paint these eggs, but not right now. We can't do that while this is all wet. What we will do in just a moment is go back to the individual eggs and work on layer 2 of those. Now I'm in very big danger of overworking this if I do much more. It's very tempting. You get your little brush out and you start putting it all on, and it just gets way overworked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause again, leave that to settle in, and I'm going to make sure that these are perfectly dry with the hairdryer, and let you catch up with your nest, and then we'll go back to do layer 2 of a little bit of shadow, a little bit of background on the eggs. Right, I'm recording again, and I'm ready to do the next step on these eggs. And the next step is to make them look a little bit more round with a little bit of shading on them. So it's pretty much using the same colors, just trying to pick out a brush that's good. So the first egg was Cerulean Blue, and I used a little bit of Cobalt for the shadow. So let's go back to that. I have a real mess where my Cerulean Blue was. I have to clean up that mess a little bit. So again, I'm going to have the Cerulean Blue. And this time I'm going to add a little bit of Cobalt. And even though this is just the blue egg, I'm going to add a little touch of raw sienna A little bit too much, a little bit more cobalt. And if you add too much of something, because it's really difficult to dip your tip of your brush in and just get a tiny amount, you can just go back and add a little bit of the other too. But don't forget to add water, because the more paint you add, the darker the tone. So I'm looking for a little scrap of paper. Here's a scrap of paper. So now I really want to test that tone that I have and make sure that it is going to work with this egg, and that looks just fine. Please always have some scraps of paper to test your colors. It's really good practice. Now this time I don't want to wet first. I'm going to wet after I put the shadow in. It's a little bit more dangerous, but it is an easier way to get a soft edge. So I want shadow under the egg here. And as I put it on, it's quite wet, so I can manipulate it. And I have a hard edge, which I don't want. So I'm going to wash my brush. I'm going to get most of the water off on my towel, so I don't have a really wet brush. A little bit more water. It's the amount of water that you use here that's critical. If you use too much, you'll get a great big back run into the shadow. If you don't use enough, you're not going to get a soft edge. You have to use just enough to ease that darker color up into the egg, but with a very soft edge. You can always go back. I've got a little bit more of the color, and I'm going to put a little bit more of the color close to the edge. While this is still wet, you can add a little bit more color. You can't add extra water. Extra water will give you a bloom, but you can add extra color. Because these eggs are a little bit mottled and textured, you can agitate your brush back and forth. And if you have any edge there that's not smooth, it will just give you a little bit of texture on the egg, which will be nice. Now, the second egg, of course, is a more browny color. So we want a more browny shadow on there. So we're going to go back to the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. I'm going to add some water to that, and I'm going to add a little bit of the raw sienna to that. So I haven't got such a dark brown, and a little bit of cobalt blue to that. So now I've got a kind of a blue gray brown color. And again, I'm going to put it close to my egg, and I'm going to test it and see what I think. And I think I need a little bit more raw sienna in that mix. I feel like it's a little bit too gray brown. Let's grab a little bit more raw sienna. Just want to get it just, I think that's more what I want. So twice I added a bit more raw sienna to the mix. And I want, if you're new to painting and you're not sure how much water to add, I want you to look at those samples, how shiny they are and how they stand up away from the paper. That is how your paint consistency should be. For many seconds, even minutes after you put that paint down, it should still look like that. It should still be wet, shiny, and standing up away from the paper. What you don't want is brush strokes that go dull immediately, unless that's exactly what you need for, say, a very textured, dry area. But this is a specialty type of area that you would want to just be very dry for a base layer. In general, if you are new to painting and you're struggling, this is what your paint should look like. Look, this is way back when I did the blue, still standing up away from the paper, still shiny and wet. This one here is just starting to dull down. And you won't get depth of color or beauty of color if you put your paint on dry like this. So a little side lesson there while I'm just going to put my shadow on this one. So I've made my paint a little bit more raw sienna-ish, and I want to put it on that lower area of the egg. And again, I'm going to get a wet brush that's not too wet. I don't want a back run. And use that wet brush to just smooth that shadow into the egg. Just smooth it in. And then while it's wet, see if you put it on wet enough, while it's wet, if you want more shadow at the base, a little bit more, that's when you can just touch. You can touch your brush to that wet paint and you can get a little bit more shadow towards the base of the egg. And see how my pencil lines are now disappearing. And the edge, I can put a little bit on the edge here. Tip of my little brush, just adding a little bit of shadow to the edge. And now I'm really cleaning and drying my brush well, and making sure that edge here is just kind of like teased into the rest of the egg. Third one here, and going back to that cerulean blue color, dark cerulean blue that I made. And I want to use that one for this egg, but I'm going to also add a little bit of the raw sienna mix as well. So first I'm putting on the cerulean blue mix that I made for the first egg, for the shadow. Under here. Wet brush, clean brush, not too wet. Have to get just the right amount of wetness on your brush to blend that color in. And now I'm going to take some of the raw sienna brown mix that I mixed for the second egg, and I'm just going to touch that and just like tipping the tip of my brush in to the bottom of the egg here, just right there, and letting that mix with my cerulean blue mix. Now, this is not the time to do more speckles or background. If you do background at this point, it's all going to blend in with the egg and you won't get a nice sharp edge. This one here has got a little bit of a water bloom. That's what happens if you have a little bit too much water. And I agitate that in with my brush, and I will fix it with some speckles in a moment. As Trisha observed in the live class, if you make a mistake, you can just stick a speckle over it, which is great advice. Don't forget that. If you've got a little mistake anywhere, drip of paint, you can just, at the final stages, put a little speckle of brown on the top and it will disappear. And you can kind of see how my pencil lines are starting to disappear as I put more paint on. Not so much this one because it's very, very light, but I can, if I want, I can add some very fine, go to a finer brush, my number 2, and back to my cerulean blue mix. I can add a bit of a line with the dark blue around the edge of the egg if I want to. And again, just agitate that in with your brush a little bit so it's not too sharp. And that will help take away any pencil lines and give your egg a sharper border. But they're starting to look more 3D, more rounded. This one will even more when we have a shadow underneath and a few little speckles on it. It will give it a little bit more dimension. So again, I want to put that aside, let that all settle in before we do another layer. What I'm going to do now is, again, I will mute and I will make sure this is perfectly dry so that we can actually paint the colors on these eggs. Now we're just going to repeat these 3 colors. It's the same 3 eggs. I put them in the nest and photographed them, and then I took them out of the nest and photographed them. So we're going to go through the same kind of formula for those. So again, I will pause at each time. Right, so my nest is now dry. I've dried it with the hairdryer and I gave my eggs a good dry. So we're going to put the light colors on these 3 eggs in the nest, and we're going to start with this one because these 2 are touching. So I want this one to dry before I do this one. And if we're putting a very little layer of paint on, it's not going to take very long to dry. So we'll do this one, then we'll do this one, and then we'll do this one. Now, where's my original here? Okay, so this one was sort of this one here. This one I think was this one here, and this one was more this one here. And it doesn't matter, you can do them any way that you want to. So let's start with this one. And I know I'm going to have difficulty because of the, like I said, the paper got a bit messed up with the masking fluid. So for this one here, I want the mostly just cerulean blue, very light. Now, what will make these eggs glow is the combination of cerulean blue and raw sienna. They're not exactly complementary colors. Like orange is the complement of blue, but this is not blue. And the raw sienna is kind of an orange because when it's burnt, it becomes that orangey brown. So you have a kind of orangey color and a kind of a light bluey color, and they do work really well as complementaries. So when you put two complementaries together, they will make them kind of shine and stand out. So that's what we're working on here with those two colors. And the cerulean blue, I'm going to start with this one. And again, I want to wet this area of the egg that's going to be a little bit lighter. And I did forget that almost. What's helpful is if you've got those two layers of dark on, it helps you go nice and light with your egg rather than make a decision to go too dark with your color. It's very hard to judge colors on their own. They are always judged relative to the colors around them. So what I'm doing is I'm just pulling up a little of that color on the highlight, and I'm adding a little of that color here where it would probably be a little bit more dark. I think it was the photographs here somewhere. There wasn't much light and shade to these because they were directly in sunlight when I photographed them. So the egg over here has a little bit of raw sienna mixed with that cerulean blue to make it that slightly more greeny blue. Just making that mix up. And that's where mixing your complementaries, or almost complementaries as these are, gives you your lovely grays and different colors like that. So again, I want to have this side sort of facing up is the highlight, which I'm just wetting. And then just having to make sure I get the right amount of paint on my brush and the right colors, because I've mixed the raw sienna and the cerulean blue to make that kind of greeny blue. And carefully on that horribly distressed paper, put that on one. So you can see it's just a slightly different blue. Now this one is going to be mostly the raw sienna. I'll go back to my just raw sienna mix. Lots of water. I want to keep these eggs really nice and light. I'm going to add, as I put that raw sienna on, add a little bit of the cerulean blue and raw sienna mix as well. I want a mix here happening. And as it comes next to this blue egg, to make the complements work, I'm going more with the raw sienna next to the blue egg, so they will work off of each other. And the blue one was almost dry when I put this in, so I do have that nice hard edge. You do have to be careful to make sure that this blue one is pretty much dry before you put that one next to it. If they bleed into each other, don't worry, just like dab it up with a Kleenex. These are light enough, you can dab it up with a Kleenex, dry with a hairdryer, and make sure that they're dry enough to put next to each other. Now, while this one's still a little bit wet, I'm just going to add a little bit of raw sienna to this one at the base. Again, to have that complementary working and to give the egg some texture. I will get a run back of color, but I want that kind of texture happening in the egg. And then we have to leave these to dry. So much leaving to dry in this one, I know. We have to leave those to dry or dry them with a hairdryer before we go on. And I would put in the speckles and shadows and finish these eggs before doing the dark interior, because you really want to judge how the colors work with each other. And if you can see, compared to this one, how different the dark is when you put it next to the light, as opposed to this one where it's not dark enough yet next to the light. It doesn't make them stand out and glow until you get this really, really dark layer on the inside of the nest. But for that to work well, these eggs have to be just perfectly dry. Otherwise, you'll just get dark smushing into the eggs and horrible effect. Now, the next stage for these ones is quite a slow process, so you can work quite slowly. These eggs are dry. I dried them with my hairdryer. And I'm now going to put on all of the final speckles on the dry eggs. And then I can put the shadows in the background, because the eggs will be nice and dry. And I don't have to worry about things bleeding over. So I want to I'm going to use my burnt sienna and ultramarine blue mix. Actually, I've got too many trays on the go here. Let's clean up this. Let's go over here. I've got space here. I don't usually clean anything up. I just use what I've got. I've got some burnt sienna and ultramarine here. Bigger brush for mixing. It doesn't matter if you have other colors in there as well, as long as you get enough of the color that you're mixing. Like, as soon as I put the ultramarine blue in there, any raw sienna or whatever might have been in there is obliterated by the ultramarine blue. And then some burnt sienna. And I'm going to make this speckled mixture a little bit darker by adding some sepia. It is pretty dark already with the two, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, but a little bit of sepia is going to take it down even darker. There we go, and nice and rich. Adding the ultramarine blue makes it a really nice, rich, dark color, and not just a brown. The brown can look dark on your palette, but when it dries, it can dry quite a bit lighter, but the blue keeps it nice and dark and intense. So I have that lovely dark color. And what I really love to do is just have the egg or the photo in front of me, so I can really look at the funny shapes that are dotted around the egg. So I'm going to get my number 2 brush now and start putting in some of these shapes. And to give this egg a really good base, I'm going to go right down to here, right down to the base of the egg with one of these first speckly dot things. They're kind of like odd little islands and continents, so they're very organic, of course, splotches and shapes. And you can have some of let's zoom in even more. You can have some of the other ones showing. You don't have to cover the other ones up, because that is exactly what the eggs look like. While you have your brush in your hand, you can do a few more typical little tiny dotty speckles. Just be careful when you come up against the edge of the egg to lift your brush up to the very point and make sure that you really get a nice crisp line on the edge. That way, if you don't have any line here, the human brain fills in that line just all by itself. It loves doing things like that. It loves finding a space where there's no line and just filling it in. It's what makes a painting kind of interesting and exciting. I've just added to my mix, I've just added a little bit of just more burnt sienna. I wanted that one a little bit redder, a little bit lighter. You can, every time you dip your brush, don't worry about having the same color. You can modify your color each time you dip your brush. Now up here where there's a highlight, I don't want it all highlighted. I want some speckles. And there's two ways I can get the highlight back. I got it back with my pastel pencil at the end, but you can also get it back by having a Kleenex in your hand, and just when you put the speckle on, just dab it a little bit so it's a little bit lighter, very gently. So I've just dabbed it and I get a little bit of light on that speckle. Now the darker egg is quite speckled. You can really kind of go to town with it. See, I've put one on there and I want it a bit highlighted. I'm just going to dab it. Now, it's really difficult to just paint it that light. The painting then dabbing is a much easier way to get that kind of a highlight. And again, don't overdo it. There's a tendency to just keep on and on and on speckling and putting dots until your whole egg has sort of disappeared. Be disciplined about when to stop. And if you at any time feel you just want to take out a little bit of that, just dab it. It really does look, where I've just dabbed it, it really does just make it look like there's a highlight on that speckle. So I think I am in danger of overdoing that one if I do any more. This one definitely needs a little bit more definition to some of the speckles. But again, because this is a lighter egg, it doesn't hurt to put them on and then dab them a little bit so that they're not so defined as they are on the really dark brown egg. Now this is, I really like this kind of painting. It's contemplative. You can just kind of get yourself lost in the time it takes to be going around speckling. At first, quite often at first, when you start something like this, your brain becomes really irritated by how detailed it is and how long it takes. And if you work through that, if you just push on through, your brain settles down and it kind of like zones out. It's like, okay, I have no control here. She's going to take her time and fiddle about with these speckles. And then that's when you get lost in the moment. You kind of relax and it becomes a more Zen-like kind of a thing. But you do have to fight quite often fight your brain at the start because it wants to get this over with. It's like too much fiddling around. Stop, get on with something else. Push on through and you'll enjoy the moment. And you see, I'm dabbing some of those speckles so they're not quite so prominent. And I have to be careful not to go completely quiet and get totally zenned out in the moment. Now this one has the fewest speckles of all, so we have to be really careful. I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna. It's not as dark. A little bit more water so that I don't have too much on here. And let's start with some of the darkest ones. It's more very, very light and quite a few little like freckles, speckles. Again, if you want to define the edge, just in some places, just get a nice edge here, bring your speckle out. I'm actually going to define this edge. I've got my speckles on, wet brush. I'm going to use my wet brush to just blend those ones in on that edge so that sometimes I have a nice sharp nice sharp ones. Sometimes I have a much more softer, a softer blended one. Another thing your brain does as you get into the painting, the moment, the zone kind of, is it shuts off your language area, and you don't want to speak. You don't have language anymore. That's why I then sort of stumbled over what I was going to say, because my language area is now shutting down and switching over into very quiet painting mode. So I will never be able to paint as well as I do when I'm silent and in my own headspace. You know, doing something like this where I'm teaching, chatting, I'm always going to make painting mistakes. I'm going to hurry too much because I can't get into that kind of zone. But that's okay, because I have plenty of time to paint, and I'm not supposed to be in the zone right now. I'm supposed to be teaching. So you just have to put up with me not painting as well as I would if I wasn't talking to you at all. And again, don't overdo this one. Don't put too many. I'm going to do some and dab on this highlight here, because it's weird if you have the highlight with nothing on it. That's not realistic. The highlight would have something on there, but we're going to take it down with some Kleenex and make it a little less obvious. And because these eggs are quite dry, just the speckles are wet, I can do a little bit of the background on these. And I felt when I did them, I knew what I wanted to do for eggs and shadow, but I had not planned a background of any kind. I wasn't really sure how this was going. And what I did do, I thought these eggs just look weird individual. I want some kind of thing between them. And I just kind of put dry grass between them. I don't know if that was a good solution, but it's what I did. So if that's what you want to do, we're going back to the raw sienna mix. I have here my raw sienna I have a tiny bit of burnt sienna with this. I'm going to get a little bit more and I'm going to wet it up. And I do want to have some burnt sienna. So next to it, not mixed in with it at this point, just next to it. So I can dip in one or the other. I'm going to have some burnt sienna, nothing else in them, just those pure colors. And I have my rigger brush. I have two rigger brushes. I have let's find my other one. I couldn't resist buying two. One is a 2/0, which is very, very fine. And this one is just a number 2. I went down to Willow's iron oxide store to get a number 1 or a 0, and they didn't have that. This is the 2 they had. And I couldn't resist getting both of them. They were only something like $5.99 each, and I loved them. I lost my other one. I have no idea where my other one got to. I think I just lost it in class. Probably got picked up by someone else or left on the floor or something. I don't know. Anyway, these are lovely. They're a Princeton velvet touch, they're called. And really, the wooden handle is finished with a paint that literally feels like velvet. It really is lovely. They're not expensive, and they have a synthetic tip. Beautiful though. I love them. And I'm just going to, with these, just kind of pull up wispy and crisscross them over, wispy kind of dried grass, you know, like a nest would have sticking out of the edge. And I dipped into the burnt sienna. I started with raw sienna. I'm just going to switch between the two, and between, I didn't measure them. Just going to put that wispy dry grass between the eggs and bring it up from the tape and wiggle it, switch between raw sienna and burnt sienna, have a little bit of a ragged edge. Remember from last week what I said about lines that cross over are interesting and beautiful. So you're aiming for that, aiming for a little bit of messiness, like the edge of the nest. And after you've got those ones, you can add some around. We're going to add shadow, but before I add the shadow, I want to add some wispy sort of areas around the egg too. Just so that it all kind of ties in. Otherwise, it kind of doesn't tie in. And you don't quite know how to finish the underneath of the egg. I remember nothing is finished until it's finished. You can always go back with more. You can always add a bit more wispiness to the edge if you want to. Some of those decisions can be made right at the very end when you're just assessing your painting. And I think I did come back and add a bit more after I'd finished. Just I thought, oh, it just needs a little bit more around the edge. Now this looks very messy at the moment, but we're going to put some shadow in so it won't look so messy. And great colors for shadows are your Cobalt Blue or your Ultramarine Blue. Let's start with, I'm going to go over here to where my Cerulean is. And I'm going to add to that a little bit of Cobalt. And there's no need to clean your palette. I clean it more often when I'm demonstrating, just so you have a bit of an area to see what I'm doing. I'm going to take some of that raw sienna with the cerulean mix and mix it with the cobalt. And this is going to be my first, a bit more cobalt. It's going to be my first shadow color. I've got two shadow colors happening. So under this egg, first of all, with dry paint, dry paper, very dry edge, I'm going to put in a little bit of shadow. Now I'm going to wet my brush and very loosely now, jiggling my brush back and forth like we did with the cerulean blue background. I'm just going to pull that shadow color away from the egg. Now we're going to put a darker one on after this. This is just to get you started. I can go into I'm going into my raw sienna, burnt sienna mix. I'm also going to add a little bit of that to the edge of the shadow. Because remember, we're working with that complementary colors to make things stand out. And if that looks a bit weird, pick up your tip of your brush and just turn it into a bit more of that kind of straw color. Now for the brownie color egg, we need a slightly deeper shadow. So I'm going back to this mix and I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of the burnt sienna mix into that to make a gray kind of ultramarine blue color. And under this egg, that slightly different color, a bit darker. So first you put on that kind of, it would be a kind of an elliptical shape. Wash my brush, get a little bit of the burnt sienna, raw sienna mix. And just on the edge of that shadow, pull that mix out and up into the grassy area. Doesn't quite go to my tape here, so I'm just going to pull that down to the tape. Third one. I have a whole mix here. This is the one I just used. This is this color. I'm going to kind of take the two, blend them together, get a little bit of shadow color. You're just using the colors that you've used all along. And put that one in under this egg. See, the shadow's dark underneath, right underneath something, but then all shadows get lighter and fuzzier towards the edge. So that's why we're going to take the raw sienna and burnt sienna mix, or just raw sienna, and just add that to the edge of the shadow. And I'm going to take my script liner with me now, and I'm just going to pull that up into the grassy area so I don't have a weird edge to it. And this is the point where I look at it and think it's all a bit too light. I'm going to go with that burnt sienna and ultramarine dark brown. I'm just going to add a few more dark strands. Now the shadows will dry much lighter, and we're going to have to put another little bit of dark shadow on as they after they're dry, because everything in watercolor dries lighter, especially when you blend it out with some water here, and like I've done. But that's okay, because it's better to come back and do a second layer of dark than to go too dark or too oddly shaped with the first layer. So that's our eggs. I don't even know what I did with my nest now. Here it is. Right. So on the nest, I need to put the speckles on the eggs. I need to find my small brush again. Lots and lots of browns and colors all over my my palette here. So I can use the colors that I have, and I can start speckling these eggs in the nest. This one is probably the most speckled. And after I've speckled these eggs, I will put the dark, really dark brown on. Also, after they're all speckled and the dark brown's on and everything's kind of finished, I will put a shadow behind this egg and a little bit of shadow on this one, but that's going to be my very final, stage before we're all finished. This one has just a few speckles, some here that are very light. Put them on, tap them off. Go into my more, I want to go into my more like burnt sienna mix here. Having a bit more burnt sienna. So this one's a more reddy brown speckle. And then we got a little bit more dark brown on this one. These are not as close up as the 3 eggs that we just did. So not as, don't have to pay so much fuss about the speckling. And you definitely don't want to overdo these because you want them to really stand out and glow. Now, if I'm careful not to touch my speckles to the edge, I can work on the dark around them without worrying about the paint bleeding out into the surrounding dark. So what I need to be around them is a really, really dark brown. So we've got to mix up. We've already got some mixed up here. I need to mix up more. So I need to get my ultramarine blue, nice and strong. Burnt sienna, same too. Make sure they're nice and strong. And then I can add some sepia to that. Get a really nice dark mix. And quite a lot of ultramarine blue, because we want to make sure that we really put some depth in behind these eggs. Less water. Now, when you want a nice dark mix, you need it wet, yes, but you can use a lot less water so that it is more intense. You've got more paint happening, but you still can't have it. You've got to have enough water to paint with it. Just not as much water as when you're doing a nice light color. So I've got to be careful with my brushes now. I'm going in with my number 4, I think should be adequate. I don't want it too small because otherwise my brush strokes will be too dry, but I don't want it too big because I want to go right in between these eggs very carefully and paint very, very dark in the nest. so that these eggs really stand out and glow. So when you're going around the eggs, you have to be super, super careful so that you get a lovely, lovely edge to them. And remember what I said about the nest edge. You don't want just a thick, dark line around the edge. You have to make sure that line goes up and becomes part of the nest, which is why your mix has to be at least liquid enough that you can manipulate the paint without it drying on you too fast. I think the hardest thing in watercolor is getting that mix just right, just enough paint and enough water. I'm going to have a little bit of, I'm going to take my very fine liner brush, and right here I'm going to bring some of those dry grasses from the nest over the top of that egg. And when these eggs, when the speckles are dry, I need to put a shadow between those two eggs so that one looks like it's in front of the other. Can't do that at the moment. I've got too much other wet paint going on here. This side of the nest is quite dark, so I'm going to bring that up around here. I'm switching back and forth between now my number 4 brush for the bigger areas and my liner brush to bring my paint up and around areas like this and like this. And another thing, you can't just have this dark in the center of the nest. It has to be reflected somewhere else in the nest. Otherwise, it just looks weird. So we need to look at the reference photo and find out what other places on the nest are the same value. There's no rush. As long as we've got this paint in nice and dark, we can take our time with the rest. One other thing we can do with that lovely dark paint is we can put a few, I'm looking for my reference photo, grab it, a few of these bits that stick up that are really dark. There's a few, like this one that sticks up here like that, has a few little bits coming off of it. There's one here, one here. Not all of them are dark, but there's a few that are. On this edge, there's a lot of sort of mossy ones. So I'm going to like wiggle my brush a lot here to put a lot of that moss in. Down here, there's some bits and pieces that have fallen off of the nest. Kind of nice to have those as well, so that the eye is drawn down here as well as in the center. That's why I said you can't just leave the center really dark. Otherwise, your eye is just drawn there and nowhere else, and it looks odd. So there are quite a few dark patches around this area, around this part of the nest. I'm going to do just a couple more with my liner brush. And then I'm going to go to my bigger brush and go to my number 6 and put in a few of those bigger areas of dark. Need a little bit more paint. So actually here on this side, so now I'm getting my bigger brush and just putting in some big areas of dark here, and there's definitely some here. It's not like a line now. There are shadows behind, shadows of mud and stuff behind these. You can connect them a little bit with some strands. Down here, I want to add a little bit more burnt sienna to the mix, warm it up a little bit. Just put a bit more around here. there's quite a bit of, move that up, there's quite a bit of moss here too, so I can kind of wiggle my brush in here and do that kind of mossy texture by kind of wiggling my brush a bit more. This side is quite a bit of that. And this is the point where you really want to get your reference photo out that I sent you and really just have a look, so you can really see what's happening, where the dark values are. And if some of them seem too blotchy, I'm just looking at some of them now and I'm thinking, okay, well, I can pull those out and crisscross them a little bit, connect them a little bit, have a few more strands down here because it is quite messy down here. And now I've put some equal measure of dark in the center and around the border. And I would have to make really sure all of this is dry before I put a little shadow behind this egg, using just one of the very light shadow mixes we made, the kind of like the blue shadow mixes. Let's see if these are not completely dry. I'm going to do a little bit of hair drying. Right, so let's I've dried everything. I'm going to put the shadow behind the egg. Let's pick the right size brush. Let's pick up my number 6 and just make it a little bit wet. I don't want to have too much shadow going on here. It's just a very subtle shadow. I'm going to use a little bit of the cobalt with a little bit of the raw sienna. I don't want it too dark, so a little bit more cobalt. I want it really, really subtle. Just behind this egg. And then I'm going to just ease that shadow in a little bit with a slightly damp brush. I think I'm going to add a little bit, because it's going behind the blue. I want to use the complementary color, the raw sienna, too. Adding a little bit more just raw sienna. To make that shadow a little bit more complementary. I'm going to have to add a little bit more of that. It's kind of getting away from me. The reason is because I used that masking fluid on the paper. It's really distressed the paper a lot and ruined it. On this egg too, I just want to add a little bit of raw sienna shadow just to that one, just a tiny bit. Don't add too much because your eggs will stop glowing and standing out in your darkness if you add too much, but just needs to be a little bit on there. And then the other thing I want to do is take my pastel pencils, and on the reference photo, there were these really bright pieces of dry grass, which I did try to use some masking fluid for those, but again, I am not very adept at masking fluid. And of course, if you use masking fluid, you end up with white areas. I'm just erasing what little bit of masking fluid I've got. You do end up with white areas of grass, so you then have to go over them with some raw sienna and make them a more straw color. But I really like this technique of using a straw colored pastel pencil and putting in just a few highlights afterwards. Now, of course, if you are a purist in watercolor, this ends up with the pastel pencil, ends up being what they call mixed media. So if you were putting this in some kind of a competition, of course, I wouldn't want you to put my painting into a competition. That would be not appropriate. But if you did one of your own, you had your own photo and you used a pastel pencil, you would have to put mixed media. It would not be then pure watercolor. I am not putting this anywhere except in your lesson. And I wouldn't even mind putting mixed media. In fact, the ones that I did recently for the show in Duncan, some of them had pastel pencil on, and I put on them watercolor mixed media with pastel pencil. As long as people know, that's okay. But it does give you some lovely light strands that you can really control well with the pastel pencils that are very difficult to control with masking fluid. The other lovely thing that you can do with them is zoom in so you can see even better what I mean. If you have lost a bit of the highlight on your egg, you can go over with some white or very light pastel pencil and you can smudge it in a little bit. And what you actually get is that very chalky texture that you really get on the egg. And it looks so realistic. It looks really lovely. So if I wanted to do that, if I wanted to put a little bit of like a raw sienna color on this egg, for instance, I can put a little bit on with the pastel pencil and just smudge it in. I can put a little bit in the background. I've got all colors here. So if I wanted to add a little bit of more raw sienna look over the top, I can do that. Lovely, lovely tools. I've only discovered them this last little while. It's one of those things I kind of knew that they existed, but never tried them. Now, the shadow is not dark enough on these. So I want to go a little bit darker and take some cobalt blue. Just cobalt blue at the moment, because I have lots of other colors on there. And I'm going to just put a little bit more shadow under that egg. I actually add, because it's a blue egg, I'm actually going to add a little bit of burnt sienna just to get my complementaries in there again. Add a little bit of burnt sienna in there. And put a slightly darker shadow under the egg. Now, of course, it's a weird shape right now, but I have to blend it in with a wet brush. I'm going to take my wet brush and even a little bit of the raw sienna mix on my wet brush and just blend it in so it's not such a weird shape. But when you're blending, be careful not to take your brush up next to the egg, because otherwise you will dilute all of the shadow that is next to the egg if you take your brush up there. You have to keep your brush away from the darkest part of the shadow. And the darkest part of the shadow, of course, is right underneath the egg. Same with this one. I'm going back with the more ultramarine blue, because this is brown. Ultramarine blue will work well as a complementary. And put that in there. A little bit of the burnt sienna on my brush. Blend it in. Pull it out to the side. But again, you don't touch the area under the egg unless you are putting more paint in there. So I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna on my brush. It can't be wetter than the paint you got in there. I've got a bit of burnt sienna on my brush, and I can put more paint in that shadow under there, but I can't go in with more water or more watery paint because it will just dilute it. Same with this one. I want to go in with a little bit more color. It has to be just less watery paint and more color. And I'm in danger of going back and getting a background with that. This one, let's just use that. I'm using that burnt sienna, ultramarine blue mix. Ultramarine blue is quite a good shadow color. If you've got other colors underneath, it will just provide a shadow that you can see through. It's a translucent shadow, and you'll see the colors underneath. So it'll be like a real shadow where you've got the colors underneath and the shadow on top of them. And that's why you don't need to mix a gray, because it's lovely to see the colors that are underneath, and blue is a lovely one for that. Or violet, but violet is not in our palette today. It's not one of the complementaries we want to use today. So we're sticking with the palette that we have rather than introduce another color. You know, quite often people will say, well, why didn't you use some violet or some gray for your shadow? It's just not in our palette today. We're not working with those colors. We can on another occasion. I'm just sharpening up the edge of the egg a little bit. So those are just minor details. And of course, when you pull back, you get the whole effect. Nobody comes up to within a centimeter of your painting to look at it. It has to be looked at from a distance. And that's when it all sort of comes into perspective if you look at it from a distance. Now, as it, like I said, as it dries, I usually walk away and I might come back and I might put a little bit more shadow on the eggs after I've walked away and come back and looked at them from a distance and seen if they do need just a little bit something else. I might think, well, they're a little bit insipid on that side. Maybe I just need a bit more blue. So I've grabbed a little bit of Cerulean Blue and I've just put a little bit more Cerulean Blue on that side. I was feeling they were just a bit too insipid, gone too over to the brown maybe. That's better. I just think that just needed a little bit more blue. So you can make those little tiny decisions. All your decisions get smaller and smaller and smaller as everything starts to dry and you kind of start to look at your painting as a whole and with a little bit of perspective too. So I know all of you, well, Jan is there and the rest of you who join later, you're probably all still painting, but that is as much as I would do in one sitting for sure. And I definitely might come back and do a little bit more work to it at a later date. But for me, this is pretty close to finish, and it might just need a little bit of touching up with this and that. Well, how did your nest turn out? I hope your eggs are beautiful and your nest is wonderful. Thank you for watching and for joining in. Next week, we will be doing an avocado and an eggplant or aubergine, depending on where you live and what you call it. Probably not as complicated as today's, more of an easy paint. So I'll see you next week. Take care and enjoy painting. Bye for now.